They were married young, bound by duty, not affection. Before they could learn each other, he left. Years passed in silence. Pride turned distance into doubt. When he returns, old wounds resurface, and truth demands reckoning. A Marriage Apart, a Regency romance audiobook, begins now. England, 1816. Viscount Alistair Whitcomb returned to Harrowdean on a cool afternoon in early autumn, when the light lay low across the fields and the hedgerows were just beginning to bronze. He reined in his horse at the crest of the final rise and looked down upon the estate that bore his title. It was not as he remembered it. The lanes were neatly kept, the fences repaired, the pasture land well grazed and orderly. Smoke rose in a steady column from the chimneys, neither neglected nor excessive. There was no sign of disorder, no visible evidence of the decay he had half expected after so many years away. He frowned slightly, an unfamiliar tension settling between his brows. 7 years. 7 years since he had last ridden this road. Newly married and newly commissioned, burdened more by his father's expectations than by the woman he had left behind. As he rode closer, servants emerged along the drive and from the stable yard with unmistakable purpose. A groom stepped forward at once to take his horse, while a footman moved ahead to open the door. A quiet word was exchanged, an instruction passed on and carried out without confusion. The estate did not stir like one surprised by its master's return, but like one long accustomed to being well managed. So, she had been diligent at least. Alistair dismounted and handed over his reins. The groom took them and turned away without pause, the rhythm of work unbroken by his arrival. No one waited for instruction, no one adjusted course. That unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Inside, the house smelled faintly of beeswax, polished wood, and something warm from the kitchens, bread, perhaps, or apples stewing with spice. The familiarity struck him unexpectedly, and he resisted the impulse to linger on it. "Her ladyship is expecting you, my lord," the butler said evenly. "She will receive you in the small drawing-room." Expecting me, Alistair thought. Of course she was. He had sent word ahead. Duty demanded at least that courtesy. As he followed the butler down the corridor, memory pressed in despite his efforts to keep it at bay. He had been scarcely more than a boy when his father had summoned him home, laid out the terms of the marriage as one might settle an account, and reminded him firmly of his obligations to name, land, and lineage. The wedding had followed within the week. Eliza had been quiet, young, composed in a way that suggested obedience rather than understanding. He had left her scarcely a fortnight later, bound first for the army and then overseas, answering a commission that had been arranged long before the wedding. He carried with him the certainty that time and distance would resolve what haste had imposed. He had not anticipated 7 years of absence. The door opened. Eliza Whitcomb, Lady Harrowdean, rose from her seat as he entered. For a moment he did not move. She was not the girl he remembered. She stood straight-backed and composed, her hands loosely clasped before her, her expression calm but not eager. Her gown was of sturdy blue muslin, plainly cut and well-fitted, chosen for durability as much as for propriety. Her hair was arranged neatly, without girlish ornament. Her eyes, grey-green as he recalled, met his without hesitation. The words were perfectly chosen, polite, correct, impersonal. "My lord," she said, inclining her head. Alistair inclined his own head in return. "My lady." Between them lay everything that had not yet been spoken. But as the silence stretched, he found himself acutely aware of an inconvenient truth. Against his will, against every grievance he had carried across oceans and years, the first thing he felt was not anger. It was admiration. Eliza gestured toward the chairs near the window. "Please be seated. You must be fatigued after your journey." Alistair remained standing. "I am accustomed to fatigue," he said coolly. "It has never prevented duty." The words were measured, yet their coldness could not be mistaken. Eliza inclined her head and returned to her seat, alone. "I trust the household has not been indulged in lax habits during my absence," he continued, his gaze shifting deliberately toward the open door, where a footman waited at discreet attention. Long stewardship without oversight has a tendency to encourage liberties. The footman stiffened. Eliza felt it like a ripple through the room. "The household has conducted itself with propriety," she said evenly. "I have seen to it." He turned his attention fully upon her then. "You have seen to it," he repeated. "Indeed." The faint emphasis made the phrase sound presumptuous rather than competent. "You will understand," he said, his voice carrying now, "that I shall be reviewing every aspect of the estate. Any arrangements made in my absence will of course be considered provisional." There it was. Eliza felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not lower her gaze. "Of course, you are the master of Harrowdean." "See that tea is served," he said sharply to the footman. "And have the ledgers brought to my study this evening?" "Yes, my lord," came the reply, respectful, but without haste, Alistair noticed. Eliza rose. "I shall have them prepared," she said. "They are already in order." He gave a thin smile. "I am sure you believe so." It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it landed like a slap. When he left the room, there was a moment of stillness. Then the housekeeper appeared and moved quietly to Eliza's side. "Shall I see to the rest of the arrangements, my lady?" she asked, her tone steady, loyal. Eliza drew a breath and nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Allen." Only when she was alone did she allow her composure to crack, just enough to feel the sting. So this was how he meant to punish her, quietly, by undermining her position within the house. Dinner progressed beneath a surface of civility that felt increasingly fragile. Eliza sat opposite Alistair at the long table, her posture composed, her hand steady as she lifted her glass. The green velvet of her gown caught the candlelight softly, and her fair, medium blonde hair, pinned neatly at her nape, reflected a pale warmth that contrasted sharply with the coolness of his gaze. Across the table, Alistair cut a composed figure. Tall and powerfully built, he carried himself with disciplined ease, his movements economical rather than showy. Dark hair, worn plainly, fell as it would, lending him a faintly windswept look that stood in contrast to the formality of the evening. His hazel brown eyes were steady and unreadable, his features strong rather than handsome, shaped by restraint. He carried an air of quiet authority, sharpened by years abroad, that drew attention without seeking it. The courses were served and removed with quiet efficiency. Neither of them spoke unless it was necessary. Every movement felt measured, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Midway through the final course, Alistair set down his fork. "That will be all," he said, his voice calm and carrying. "You may leave us." The servants froze. No one moved. For a brief telling moment, eyes turned, not toward him but toward Eliza. She felt it at once. She did not look surprised. She did not hurry. Eliza inclined her head slightly. Only then did the staff withdraw, retreating with quiet efficiency, the door closing behind them with careful discretion. Alistair's jaw tightened. The silence that followed the servant's departure felt heavy. "You have grown accustomed to command," he said. "That ends now." Eliza remained seated, her spine straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "I will resume full control of Harrowdean," he continued. "The steward will answer to me. Any decisions made in my absence will be subject to my approval or reversal." A flicker crossed her face, quickly mastered. "Mr. Harding, who has served as steward here for over 20 years, has done so faithfully," she said. "He knows its rhythms, its people." "That will be for me to determine," Alistair replied. She met his gaze without flinching. He watched her closely, clearly expecting resistance. When none came, his expression hardened. Whatever authority you have exercised here was provisional, he went on, a necessity created by my absence. It should not be mistaken for permanence. Her mouth curved slightly, not in amusement, but in something sharper. And this, she said quietly, is your punishment. His eyes narrowed. You did not conduct yourself as a wife ought, Alistair said. Your conduct while I was abroad was improper. Eliza's hands tightened once, then stilled. I was told of your attentions, he continued, your walks, your conversations, the impression you allowed to stand. I should have been more careful, she said quietly. I did not consider how it might appear. His gaze sharpened. You did more than allow appearances. She drew a slow breath. I was alone for years, with no word from you. I was 16 when you left me. I do not offer that as excuse, only as truth. That truth does not absolve you. No, she agreed, it does not. The admission seemed to check him, if only briefly. But I did not betray you, she went on, her voice low and steady. I never gave another man what belonged to you. He studied her in silence. That may be so, he said at last, yet your conduct stripped this marriage of trust. She inclined her head. Then I regret my part in that loss. A pause stretched between them, filled with things unsaid. For the present, Alistair said, this marriage will exist in name only. You will maintain propriety, nothing more. Eliza inclined her head. The gesture was restrained, almost formal. I will accept whatever distance you require, she said, but I will not accept being judged for what I did not do. She rose and walked to the door without haste. The latch turned softly beneath her hand, and the door closed behind her with quiet finality. Alistair remained where he was. He had imagined this reckoning often during the long years abroad. He had imagined the release of speaking every grievance aloud, of reclaiming authority, of setting the balance right. It did not feel as he had expected. The anger he had carried so carefully had not lightened. If anything, it sat heavier now, sharpened by the knowledge that dignity had met his accusations without collapse. He had said what he meant to say. And yet, satisfaction remained stubbornly out of reach. Chapter 2. The Mistress of the House. However determined he was to find fault, Alistair was forced to acknowledge the house's excellent order. He discovered this on his third day home, when he joined Eliza in the breakfast room to find the household already in motion. Orders given quietly, questions answered without confusion, decisions made without raised voices or visible strain. Servants came and went with purpose. Nothing felt hurried, nothing felt uncertain. It unsettled him. Eliza reviewed a small stack of papers while she took her tea, her attention divided with practiced ease. When she spoke, it was to clarify rather than command, and the effect was immediate. Yes, that will do, she said, but I would have you see the north pasture yourself, Mr. Harding. The fencing there requires judgment, not assumption. Very good, my lady, the steward replied, and went at once. Alistair watched in silence. You have accustomed them to consulting you, he said. Eliza did not look up. They are accustomed to efficiency. At last she folded the papers and rose. If you wish, I can show you the east fields. The barley has done particularly well there. It was an offer, not a request. He inclined his head and followed her outside. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and early autumn. As they walked, Eliza spoke simply of crop rotation and tenant agreements, of adjustments made during lean years and small innovations that had steadied the estate's income. She did not embellish. She did not seek approval. He found himself listening despite himself. They reached a gentle rise near the stream, where the ground sloped unevenly. Eliza slowed, not much, but enough. Alistair noticed. She placed her foot carefully. shifting her weight before continuing. The movement was precise, controlled, as though long practiced. He frowned. "You favour your step," he said. Eliza glanced at him, surprise flickering briefly across her face. Then it was gone. "Only when I am tired." They were not alone. Mr. Harding, the steward, had joined them some paces behind, his hat tucked beneath his arm, his expression attentive but unintrusive. "It has never fully mended," the steward said quietly. Eliza stopped walking. "That was not necessary," she said. Mr. Harding did not apologise. "You were injured seeing to young Thomas when the cart overturned. You pulled him clear before the horse could bolt." Alistair turned to her sharply. "You were hurt?" "Yes," she said, after a moment. "I was." "How?" Her gaze shifted to the fields, the barley moving gently in the breeze. "A fractured ankle, some damage that did not resolve as it should." "And no one thought to inform me," he said. She looked at him then, steadily. "You were overseas." The words were not reproachful. They were factual. "She would not rest," Mr. Harding added, as if this were simply part of the record. "The boy recovered. Her ladyship was back on her feet before the harvest was finished." Eliza drew a breath. "That will be all, Mr. Harding." The steward inclined his head and stepped away. For a moment neither of them spoke. Alistair looked at her, not as the wife he had accused, nor as the capable manager he had begrudgingly acknowledged, but as a woman who had intervened when it mattered, and borne the consequence without complaint. "You might have delegated," he said. "Yes," she replied, "I might have." They resumed walking, her pace measured, his thoughts anything but. If Alistair had expected Eliza's authority to diminish once he made his presence felt, he was disappointed. The days that followed unfolded with the same quiet efficiency. Tenants arrived to speak of rents and repairs, and though they bowed properly to him, their eyes drifted almost unconsciously toward her. They addressed their concerns plainly, without fear or obsequiousness, and left with the air of people who trusted they had been heard. Alistair sat in on several such meetings, saying little. He watched Eliza listen, truly listen, her attention fixed, her questions precise. When decisions were made, they were explained simply, without indulgence or severity. She did not seek his approval. She did not contradict him, either. It was a restraint that irritated him far more than defiance would have. Later, he reviewed the household accounts. The ledgers were meticulous, neat columns, careful annotations, nothing extravagant, nothing neglected. Improvements were noted without flourish. A new agreement with a neighbouring dairy, preserved fruit sold to a nearby market town, wool redirected through a more reliable merchant. Mr. Harding stood nearby, hands clasped behind his back. "These arrangements were made with your ladyship's oversight," the steward said. "I offered counsel where I could." Alistair looked up. "You seem to offer it readily still." "Yes, my lord," Harding replied evenly, "where it is welcome." The implication was quiet and unmistakable. That evening, dinner was served in measured courses. The table reflected the estate itself. Abundance without excess. A wheel of pale cheese, rich and clean tasting, followed a roast prepared with herbs from the kitchen garden. Preserved berries appeared later, their sweetness balanced, their flavour unmistakably local. "This is all from Harrowdean?" Alistair asked at last. "Yes," Eliza replied. It seemed prudent to rely less on outside suppliers. "Prudent," he repeated. She met his gaze briefly. "It has been effective." Again, no boast, only fact. After the meal, she rose without hesitation. "If you have no further need of me, I will see to tomorrow's arrangements." He had intended to dismiss her first. The realization annoyed him. "Very well," he said. She offered a brief curtsy and left the room. Alistair remained seated for a long moment afterward, his attention fixed on the dying candles. He had returned expecting disorder, if not of the house, then of the woman who had been left in charge of it. Instead, he found himself increasingly at odds with a truth he did not wish to name. Eliza Whitcomb did not preside over Harrowdean by accident, or indulgence, or sentiment. She had earned it. And the longer he observed her, the more uneasy he became at the thought that the house did not merely tolerate her authority, it relied upon it. The afternoon was given over to the estate. Alistair rode with Eliza along the outer boundaries, accompanied at a distance by Mr. Harding. The fields were orderly, the hedges trimmed, the lanes sound beneath the horses' hooves. Everywhere they went, tenants paused in their work, not with the wary deference Alistair remembered from boyhood, but with an easy respect that carried no fear. "Good afternoon, my lady," one man called, touching his cap. Eliza returned the greeting without slowing her horse. "How fares your wife?" "Much improved, thank you." "That is good to hear." Alistair watched the exchange with a tightening jaw. No appeal had been made to him, no permission sought. He dismounted near the western paddock, where new fencing had been erected. The work was solid, practical, and plainly necessary. "This was not here before," he said. "No," Eliza replied. The old rails had rotted through. "And you authorised the expense?" Alistair asked. "Yes," Eliza replied. He walked the length of it in silence, testing the posts with his hand. They held firm. "And Mr. Fenton raised no objection," he said at last. "He was consulted," she answered. "He understood the reason." Again, no defence, no justification, only facts. They returned to the house in the late afternoon, the sun low and slanting across the lawns. Eliza moved with the same careful steadiness he had noticed before. When she thought herself unobserved, her step shortened slightly. It irritated him that he noticed. That evening she did not dine with him. Mrs. Allen informed him that her ladyship had taken a tray in her room and retired early. Alistair dismissed her with a nod. He had set the pace that afternoon. The ride to the south pasture had been longer than necessary. He had insisted upon seeing the boundary himself. She had kept pace without complaint, though he remembered now the way she had sat a little too still in the saddle on the return, her gloved hand tightening once at the pommel when the wind cut sharp across the rise. She had said she was well. He had chosen to believe her. The dining room felt larger in her absence. Later he walked the house, restless, aware of how thoroughly it functioned without reference to him. Doors closed softly, candles were lit where needed. The household moved as though guided by a will that did not require his presence. In the small drawing room he paused before the window and looked out over the grounds. The place did not feel merely preserved for his return. It felt as much as he resented it, like an estate that had learned to thrive without him. Chapter 3. A Marriage in Name Only. Alistair reviewed the figures twice before he summoned the steward. The income was modest but steady, too regular to be a coincidence, too consistent to be an error. It did not correspond to rents, nor to any agreement he recalled authorising. Mr. Harding arrived promptly, his manner composed. "These receipts," Alistair said, indicating the page. "Explain them." "The ale, my lord," Harding replied at once. Alistair looked up. "What ale?" "The household brew," the steward said. "We provide for our own first. What remains is sold locally." A pause followed. "And when was this undertaken?" "Nearly 5 years ago. The brewhouse was repaired. We began growing hops on the lower ground. It reduced costs immediately." "And this was approved?" "Yes, my lord. The solicitor Mr. Fenton reviewed the expense." Alistair sat back in his chair. He did not speak at once. "You may go," he said at last. Harding inclined his head and withdrew. Later that morning, Alistair found Eliza in the housekeeper's room, reviewing the week's orders with Mrs. Allen. She rose at once when he entered. "I require access to the brewhouse," he said without preamble. "This afternoon." Mrs. Allen glanced briefly toward Eliza, then stepped back without comment. "Of course," Eliza said. "I will have the key sent to your study." "I am going now," he replied. "I would prefer not to wait." Her expression did not change. She reached into the drawer beside her and withdrew a small ring of keys, selecting one without hesitation. "This will open the outer door," she said. "Mr. Harding will see that you are not interrupted." Alistair accepted the key. "You have overseen this project personally," he said. "Yes." "For some years." "Yes." "And during that time," he continued, his voice controlled, "you saw no reason to consult me." She met his gaze steadily. "You were abroad." "So I am reminded," he said. "Often." Alistair's eyes remained fixed on Eliza. "You have made yourself indispensable here." "I did what was required," she replied. "That is not the same thing." "No," she agreed, "it is not." A silence followed, dense and unmistakable. "For the present, I shall look to these arrangements myself." "Of course." There was no resistance in her tone, no appeal. A silence settled between them. Alistair looked at the keys in his hand, then back at her. Whatever he had intended to say next did not come. Eliza spoke first. "If there is nothing further, I will continue with Mrs. Allen." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. He bowed his head once, curtly. She returned to the table without another glance, her attention already shifting back to the papers before her. Mrs. Allen stepped forward at once, resuming their quiet exchange. Alistair left the room. Only later, when Eliza was alone at last, did the familiar ache return. Not sharp, but constant. The grief of a marriage conducted through necessity rather than choice, of hopes she had once allowed herself, imagining a reconciliation that now seemed more unlikely than ever. She did not often permit her thoughts to stray to Mr. Merrick. There was little purpose in it now. He had spoken with sympathy, with understanding, had presented himself as safe, as a friend. He had known how isolated she was, how long she had waited for letters that never came, and when others began to draw conclusions, he had made no effort to correct them. She had not been blameless, but neither had she been reckless in the way he later allowed others to believe. Her husband had made it clear that he did not credit her explanation. He was resolved to keep his distance. She would not plead for affection that had never been freely given. The brewhouse stood at the edge of the inner yard, its brickwork darkened by age and smoke. Alistair had passed it countless times in boyhood without notice. It had been a background presence then, functional, unremarkable, beneath consideration. Now, it drew his attention unwillingly. Mr. Harding met him at the door, his manner as steady as ever. "My lord," he said, "if you please." Inside, the air was warm and faintly sweet, heavy with malt and steam. Copper vessels gleamed where they had been recently scoured. Barrels were stacked neatly along the far wall, each marked by a careful hand. Alistair paused just inside the threshold. "This was repaired," he said. "Yes, my lord." The old copper was sound enough, but the fittings had failed. Her ladyship insisted it be done properly, or not at all. Alistair did not comment. Harding moved through the space with ease, explaining only what was asked. Grain was brought in from the estate's own stores. The mash was measured precisely. The water was drawn from a clean source upriver, observed and carefully managed. No shortcuts, Harding said. That was her ladyship's instructions. "And the hops?" "Grown on the lower ground," the steward replied, south-facing, sheltered from the worst of the wind. Alistair frowned. He had ridden that land only days before, without thinking to ask what was grown there. "They were planted with care," Harding continued. "Took time to establish. The first year yielded little worth keeping. Her ladyship did not press the hops until they were fit for use. The detail found its mark." They moved deeper into the brewhouse. One of the men looked up briefly, nodded, and returned to his work without hesitation. There was no scrambling at Alistair's presence, no sign of unease. The process unfolded methodically, heat controlled, Time observed. Nothing hurried. How often do you brew? Alistair asked. Twice a month, Harding replied. More in winter. The household and the men receive their portion first. What remains is sold. One of the men looked up briefly, nodded, and returned to his work. There was no scrambling at Alistair's presence, no sign of unease. The work continued at an even pace. Alistair's gaze shifted, taking in the room anew. And the men? Steadier, Harding said simply. Fewer complaints, fewer absences. Alistair's mouth tightened. He had not asked about morale. The answer had come anyway. They stopped beside the barrels. Harding rested his hand on one without ceremony. The accounts reflect only the surplus, he said. Her ladyship was clear on that point. Alistair looked again at the copper, at the worn floor beneath it. Everything here bore the mark of use. She was involved in every stage, he said. She wished to understand it, Harding replied. Alistair's gaze flicked to him. And you found that necessary? I found it sensible, Harding said. She made her decisions accordingly. That too sat uncomfortably. They stepped back into the yard. The air outside felt cooler, sharper. Alistair dismissed the steward with a nod and stood for a moment alone, his gaze returning to the brewhouse door. He had expected to find evidence of overreach, enthusiasm untempered by sense, perhaps, or sentiment mistaken for management. He had found none. Later that afternoon, he encountered Eliza in the East Passage. She was speaking quietly to a footman, already turning away as he nodded. When she turned, she showed no surprise at the sight of him. You have seen the brewery, she said. Yes, she waited. He said nothing more. The brewing will continue, unless you direct otherwise, she said. The surplus is taken regularly by the inns in the neighbouring villages. The arrangements are settled. I will consider it, he replied. As you wish, she said evenly. There was no challenge in her voice, no appeal. As she moved past him, he noticed again the carefulness of her step. Not pronounced, but present. A small, habitual adjustment, as though long learned. He watched her go, irritation stirring where satisfaction should have been. The brewhouse had answered his questions. What troubled him now were the ones it had raised. The day ended without reconciliation. They dined together that evening, as propriety required, but little passed between them beyond the necessary. The table was laid with care, the meal well ordered, the courses paced with practised ease. Eliza spoke only when addressed. Alistair responded with politeness, so precise it bordered on severity. Nothing was amiss, and yet nothing was right. When the servants withdrew, the silence lengthened. You have arranged matters efficiently, Alistair said at last. The agreements with the inns, the brewing itself, even the tenants speak well of it. Eliza inclined her head. It seemed prudent. So I am told. The faint emphasis did not escape her. He lifted his glass, regarding its contents with a detached expression. One grows accustomed to managing alone, I imagine, without guidance, without restraint. Her fingers tightened briefly around her napkin. I acted within what was permitted to me, she said calmly. Yes, he replied, permitted. He set the glass aside. And yet, permission has a way of being stretched. The implication lay between them, unspoken, unmistakable. Eliza did not rise to it. She had learned how little good that would do. You were placed in a difficult position, he continued, his tone measured. Left young, left unguarded, circumstances encourage mistakes. At last, she looked at him. If you have something to accuse me of, my lord, she said evenly, you may do so plainly. A pause followed, longer than before. I am merely observing, he said. That conduct, once questioned, is not easily redeemed. The words struck exactly where he intended. Eliza held his gaze. Nor is judgment, once fixed. Something flickered across his expression. Irritation, perhaps, or the briefest doubt, but it was gone at once. The conversation did not recover. When they rose from the table, she excused herself without ceremony. He did not follow. Later, alone in her chamber, Eliza unpinned her hair and laid aside the gown she had chosen with care. The mirror reflected a woman composed, her expression steady, her movements precise. She had thought her conduct would suffice. It had not. He did not wish to be convinced. Very well. She would let him think as he chose. Chapter 4. Rumours and Reputations. The visit was not unexpected. Lady Harcourt had written some days earlier to announce her intention of calling, bringing her nephew and a neighbour or two from the adjoining estate. It was the sort of civility that could not be refused without comment, particularly now that Haradine's master had returned. Eliza wore pale blue muslin, simply cut and unadorned, the colour soft against her composed expression. Her hair was dressed with care rather than fashion. Nothing about her manner invited notice. Nothing repelled it either. Alistair stood among them, answering when addressed, though part of his attention remained elsewhere. Introductions were made, courtesies exchanged, tea was served, and conversation settled into the easy rhythm expected of such occasions. It was Lady Harcourt who first remarked upon the estate. "You have been very fortunate," she said lightly. "Haradine has flourished, despite the circumstances." Eliza inclined her head. "We were fortunate in our people." "And in your fortitude," Lady Harcourt added. "It cannot have been easy managing so much alone." The emphasis was slight. The meaning was not. "Still," Lady Harcourt continued, smiling, "you were not entirely without society. Mr. Merrick was often seen here, was he not?" The name landed with careless ease. Alistair felt it at once, a tightening in his chest. He had heard Merrick's name before, and never idly. Years ago, it had reached him folded into a letter from home. The script familiar, the tone carefully reassuring. "You should be aware," it had begun. Nothing had been stated plainly, nothing needed to be. Only insinuation. A gentleman often in her company, that his wife had not been entirely alone, that certain appearances had been remarked upon. He remembered reading it by lamplight, the sounds of the camp drifting beyond his tent, the paper creased and recreased in his hands. After that, it became harder to write to her. Each letter he began felt strained, each word insufficient. What once had come easily now required explanation, and he found he did not wish to offer it. Silence, at first accidental, grew deliberate. Now that same name was spoken lightly, over tea, as though it were of no consequence at all. Eliza did not startle. She did not flush. She merely answered. He called occasionally, as others did. "Of course," Lady Harcourt said. "Such things are rarely remarked upon without reason." The conversation moved on. The remark did not. Alistair said nothing. The image had already formed, unbidden, unwelcome, vivid. Later, when the visitors had gone and the house returned to its quieter rhythm, he found himself watching Eliza with a new and sharper attention. He understood then how scandal took root, not with accusations, but with questions posed as concern. Alistair found her later that evening in the west sitting room, where the windows looked out toward the fading light. She was seated at the small writing desk, a ledger open before her, though she did not appear to be writing. "You conducted yourself very well today," he said from the doorway. She looked up at once. "Thank you." "It is not always easy," he went on, "to be the subject of observation." The words were carefully chosen. So was his tone. Eliza waited. She had learned, over the years, when silence served her better than defence. "Lady Harcourt is not unkind," he continued, "but she is attentive." "Yes," Eliza said. "She always has been." He crossed the room slowly. She spoke of visitors. So she did. And of those who were seen here with some regularity, there it was. Eliza closed the ledger and folded her hands upon it. If you wish to speak of Mr. Merrick, she said evenly, you may do so directly. A flicker of irritation crossed his expression. I did not accuse you of anything, he said. No, she agreed, you implied. A pause followed. The fire settled softly in the grate. At the time, he said at last, appearances were not favourable. She drew a measured breath. No, they were not. And yet, he continued, you do not deny them. I deny what was never true, she replied. I do not deny that I was grateful for company. The words hung between them. Calm, deliberate, unmistakable. You were married, he said. Yes. Her gaze did not waver. And alone. His jaw tightened. You do not consider that an explanation, he said. No, she answered quietly. I consider it context. He turned away, as though the distinction irritated him. You admit, then, that there was a familiarity? I admit, she said, that I spoke with a man who treated me with courtesy when I had been nearly 2 years without word from my husband, years in which I did not know whether you lived or died. The words were controlled, not sharp, but they carried weight. I did not betray you, she continued. I did not invite impropriety, and I will not apologize for seeking conversation in a silence I did not choose. For the first time since his return, she did not soften the truth for his comfort. Alistair remained still, his back to her. Whatever he had expected, contrition perhaps, or quiet compliance, this was not it. You believe, he said at last, that loneliness excuses poor judgment. I believe, she replied, that loneliness explains it, and explanation is not the same as excuse. He turned then, studying her as though she were newly revealed. She met his gaze without challenge, but without retreat. If you have already judged me, she said, then no defence will satisfy you. But I will not abase myself for conduct that never crossed the line you imagine. The silence that followed was deeper than before. It unsettled him more than any protest could have done. They did not continue the conversation. Eliza excused herself with courtesy intact and composure unbroken, leaving Alistair standing where he was. He did not call her back. He would not have known what to say that did not risk saying too much. Later, he walked the grounds alone. Dusk had settled fully by then. The paths edged in shadow. The air cool and faintly scented with earth and leaves. The estate lay quiet, ordered, responsive, as it had been since his return. As it had been, he was forced to acknowledge long before it. Her words returned to him with unwelcome clarity. He had written during that time. Of that he was certain. Briefly, at first, when movement was constant and orders uncertain, but he had written. Later, more sporadically, from places whose names he had never thought to share. He had not told her where he was sent. He had not explained how letters were carried, or how often they failed to reach their destination. He had assumed she would understand the silence as a consequence of duty. He had never considered that she might understand it as choice. The thought unsettled him. He stopped near the boundary hedge and stood there, hands clasped behind his back. If she had encouraged Merrick, accepted his attention, his conversation, his companionship, he could have condemned it. Judgment was easier. It asked nothing of him. But loneliness, spoken plainly and without plea, was harder to dismiss. He had not liked the steadiness with which she had met him, the absence of apology, the refusal to abase herself for peace. It suggested conviction, and conviction, in a woman he had married in haste and left in silence, unsettled him more than contrition ever could have done. Later, in his study, he poured a glass of wine and left it untouched. He found himself wondering against his will how often her patience had been tried, how many evenings had passed like this one, orderly and quiet, with nothing to suggest that endurance would ever be noticed. The thought did not soften him, but it disturbed him. And that, he suspected, was far more dangerous. Chapter 5. Cracks in Certainty. Doubt did not set in all at once. It came instead in small, persistent observations, none decisive on its own, each difficult to dismiss. Mrs. Allen spoke of Eliza as a matter of course. When Alistair inquired after household matters, the housekeeper answered readily, referring decisions to her ladyship without hesitation or apology. She prefers the linens turned weekly, Mrs. Allen said at one point, smoothing a crease at her cuff. Says it spares the wear in the long run. Later, a footman mentioned repairs completed the previous winter, noting only that the work had been scheduled between storms. A groom spoke of feed stores laid in early, of horses kept sound through months that had strained neighbouring estates. Each remark was offered as fact. None were offered for effect. Eliza herself moved through the house with the same steadiness. Alistair began to notice how often she paused before stairs, how she rested one hand briefly against a table before continuing on. Not weakness, management. As though she measured herself as carefully as she did everything else. At breakfast one morning, she set down her cup and rose before the meal was finished. When she returned, her expression was unchanged, but there was a faint pallor beneath her composure. "You are unwell," he said, before he thought better of it. She looked at him in mild surprise. No, the answer was immediate, reflexive. He said nothing further, but the moment lingered longer than he expected. Later that day, he reviewed the accounts again, not because he mistrusted them, but because he could not reconcile them with the story he had told himself. The figures spoke of patience, of planning that extended beyond a season, beyond immediate advantage. Nothing reckless, nothing indulgent, only continuity. That evening, as he crossed the lower hall, he heard laughter from the servants' supper room, brief, unguarded. When Eliza's name was mentioned, it was followed not by lowered voices, but by familiarity, affection even. It unsettled him. He had expected fear, perhaps, or obedience. He had not expected warmth. For the first time since his return, Alistair allowed the question to form, not fully, not comfortably, but unmistakably. What if he had been wrong? Alistair found that the house resisted his assumptions, not openly, not with defiance, but with a quiet consistency that made every sharp thought feel increasingly misplaced. He began to notice how often Eliza was consulted, not ceremoniously, but instinctively. A footman paused at the threshold of the breakfast room until she gave a small nod. Mrs. Allen adjusted the timing of a delivery after a brief word with her, then carried it out without further discussion. Even Harding deferred to her judgment with an ease that suggested long practice. None of it was performative. No one looked to see whether Alistair observed. That, perhaps, unsettled him most. He encountered Eliza one afternoon in the passage near the still room. She had removed her gloves and was speaking quietly with a maid, her voice low but steady, giving instruction with her usual clarity. A ledger lay open on the narrow table beside her, neatly marked in her hand. When the maid departed, Eliza closed the book and turned and swayed, just perceptibly, before regaining her balance. "You should sit," Alistair said. She stilled. "I am quite well." The reply came too quickly. "You are not," he said, more sharply than he intended. A pause followed. She studied him for a moment, as though assessing whether the remark required answer. "I am merely tired," she said at last. "It will pass." It did not sound like complaint. It sounded like fact. Nor had she allowed it to alter a single duty. He stepped aside to let her pass. Only after she had gone did he notice the faint pause she allowed herself at the end of the corridor, one hand resting briefly against the wall before she continued on. Later that day, he reviewed the accounts yet again, this time with Harding present. "These projections," Alistair said, tapping the page, "they extend 3 years." "Yes, my lord." "You were confident enough to plan that far ahead." Harding hesitated only briefly. Her ladyship preferred not to rely upon good fortune, and if circumstances changed— They did, Harding replied. Adjustments were made. Without drama, without complaint, Alistair closed the ledger. He had told himself that indulgence would reveal itself eventually, that vanity would leave its mark somewhere, in unnecessary expense, in a wardrobe chosen for display and purchased at the estate's expense. Yet her gowns were simply made of serviceable materials, worn more than once, chosen for sense rather than notice. He found instead restraint, patience, a long view. That evening he passed the servants' hall and heard his wife's name spoken again, not in deference but in familiarity. A brief laugh followed. Someone remarked that she would not thank them for neglecting their duties on her account. Alistair continued on, the sound following him down the corridor. It occurred to him, uncomfortably, that loyalty like that was not commanded. It was earned, and the thought brought with it another, one he did not yet wish to pursue. If she had been careless, if she had been as he imagined, would the house have stood so firmly in her defence? The question lingered long after he had tried to dismiss it. The truth came to him unexpectedly. Alistair had gone into Eliza's morning room to return a book he had borrowed without thinking to ask. The space was quiet, orderly, shaped by use rather than display. A small writing desk stood near the window, its drawers neatly arranged. One drawer had been left ajar. He would have closed it without looking, had the familiar edge of paper not caught his attention. Inside lay a bundle of letters, carefully tied with ribbon, the corners worn soft with handling. He recognized his own hand at once. He did not touch them immediately. They had been kept together, not mixed with household correspondence or set aside as irrelevant. Preserved. At last, he lifted the bundle and loosened the ribbon. There were fewer than he expected, far fewer. He sorted through them slowly, his pulse steady, his thoughts anything but. The dates told their own story. One from shortly after his departure, another some months later, a third near the end of his second year abroad, and then nothing. Years of silence, represented not by absence, but by the quiet finality of what remained. He unfolded the first letter. The tone was formal, dutiful, informative. He noted, with a tightening in his chest, how carefully he had avoided sentiment, how little reassurance it offered, how deliberately impersonal it was. The second was no warmer. He read on, his own words returning to him, stripped of intention and memory. Reports of health, of weather, of obligation, nothing of fear, nothing of longing, nothing that might have comforted a young wife left alone with no certainty of his return. They read now not as restraint, but as coldness. He closed his eyes briefly. These were the letters she had received, these, and no more. He had mistaken her restraint for indifference. He had never considered that this was all she had been given to answer. He retied the ribbon carefully and replaced the letters exactly as he had found them. When he left the room, he did so quietly, as though sound itself might disturb the truth he had uncovered. For the first time it occurred to him, not as accusation but as unavoidable fact, that her endurance had not been met with comfort, nor her patience with trust, only distance. And that, he understood now, might have been the deepest injury of all. Chapter 6. What Was Lost. Alistair did not speak to her about the letters at once. He told himself there was no urgency, that nothing would be gained by pressing the matter before he understood it himself. Yet the knowledge followed him through the house, present in every room and in every silence between them. By the second evening, restraint no longer felt like prudence, it felt like cowardice. He found her in the small morning room just after dusk, the last of the daylight fading beyond the windows. 2 candles had been lit on the side table, their glow steady against the gathering dark. She sat near the hearth with an embroidery frame resting in her lap. "Eliza," he said. The use of her name seemed to surprise her more than anything else. She set her work aside at once. Yes. He remained where he was, one hand resting against the back of a chair. I have been reviewing some old papers, he said, from the years I was away. She waited. I should like to ask you something, he continued, choosing each word with care, and I would prefer an honest answer. She inclined her head slightly. You shall have it. How often, he asked, did you receive letters from me? The question landed quietly. Eliza did not look away. She folded her hands in her lap, her composure suggesting not preparation, but acceptance. Sporadically, she said after a moment. At first there were some, close together. She paused, then farther apart. Enough to know you were alive, not enough to rely upon. And after they stopped? Nothing, she said. The word was neither bitter nor soft, merely stated. And what did you think of that? He asked. She held his gaze. I assumed you had been given reason to doubt me. The words were quiet, not defensive, not afraid. His jaw tightened. Merrick. I thought it likely, she said. You had reason. He exhaled once, unsteady. A pause settled between them. Why did you not ask me? She said at last. Not sharply, not accusingly, simply curious. If you believed there was cause. The question struck harder than reproach would have. Alistair did not sleep well that night. The house was quiet, the sort of stillness he had once welcomed. Now it pressed in on him, filled with the weight of things left unsaid. He lay awake long after the lamps had been extinguished, replaying the conversation in fragments he could not rearrange to his satisfaction. What remained with him was not any single sentence, but the pattern of it, the way her answers had thinned, then ceased altogether. Letters enough to mark his survival, never enough to depend upon. The understanding settled slowly, and would not leave him. By morning he found himself restless, unable to settle to anything that required sustained attention. He walked the lower corridors instead, observing the household as though seeing it for the first time. Eliza moved through the rooms with her usual composure, but he noticed now how careful she was with her time. She listened fully before responding, as though she had learned long ago, not to waste attention where it was not required. When servants spoke to her, they did so without haste or fear, confident of being heard. He had once told himself this ease was merely habit. Now he wondered how much of it had been learned in years when there had been no one else to rely upon. At breakfast, she took tea instead of coffee and ate very little. On any other morning, he might not have remarked it. He did now. You should eat, he said. She looked up, faintly surprised. I have. You have scarcely touched anything, he said after a moment. I am not hungry, she said. The words were mild, final. He let the matter rest, though the impulse to insist lingered uncomfortably. Later, he accompanied her through the East Wing, where she reviewed repairs scheduled for the coming month. She spoke plainly, without ornament, explaining decisions made years earlier and the reasoning behind them. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no sense that she expected challenge or praise. He found himself listening more closely than he had intended. When they reached the end of the gallery, she paused and turned to him. If you prefer matters handled differently now that you are home, she said, I will adjust. It was offered without resentment. The word struck him harder than any accusation might have done. No, he said, after a moment, there is no need. She studied him briefly, as though surprised by the answer, then nodded her head and continued on. That evening, he dined with her again, the conversation restrained but no longer brittle. He noticed when she reached for water instead of wine. He noticed how often she listened rather than spoke. He said little. He did not yet trust himself to say the right thing, but when she rose from the table, he stood as well, offering his arm without thinking. She hesitated, only a fraction of a second before accepting. The contact was brief, proper, nothing more. And yet, as they crossed the room together, Alistair felt the weight of that small courtesy settle upon him, unexpected and not easily dismissed. He had thought change would arrive with words. He was beginning to understand how often it began without them. Later that night, Alistair returned to his study and closed the door. The fire had burned low, the room lit only by a single lamp. He did not sit at once. Instead, he stood at the desk, his hand resting on its edge, as though steadying himself against a thought he was not yet prepared to name. He had believed himself wronged. The belief had been useful. It had given shape to his anger, purpose to his distance. It had allowed him to return home, certain of his injured dignity, and of his right to withdraw from the marriage he had once hoped to build. Now that belief no longer held. What remained was harder to bear. He thought of Eliza as she had sat before him, composed, measured, offering no accusation. She had spoken of waiting, as one might speak of weather endured. Something that happened, something survived, not something protested. The truth pressed upon him with unwelcome clarity. She had shaped her life around absence without ever demanding explanation. She had governed, endured, planned, while believing herself quietly set aside, and he had allowed it. He poured a glass of port and left it untouched. It occurred to him then that the reserve he now maintained out of caution bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the reserve he had once chosen out of pride. The distinction mattered, but less than he would have liked. He had asked for honesty. He had received it. What he had not yet given was courage. Alistair moved to the window and looked out over the darkened grounds. Beyond the trees lay roads he had once travelled without hesitation. Campaigns survived, decisions made under fire when delay had meant failure. This, he acknowledged grimly, should not demand greater resolve than that, and yet it did, because this offered no shelter of duty, no comfort of rank, only the risk of laying himself open. When he finally turned from the window, he understood that whatever lay between him and his wife could no longer be managed by restraint alone. Soon, he would have to speak, not yet, but soon. Chapter 7. Seeing Her Anew. Alistair found that his habits were changing before he quite recognised them as such. He rose earlier than he had in years, not from restlessness this time, but from an unfamiliar impulse to witness the day as it began. The estate lay quiet in the early light, the air cool and clear, the sky just beginning to pale above the fields. Eliza was already awake. He encountered her near the rear terrace, where she stood speaking with Harding, a folded paper in her hand. She listened without interruption, her attention fixed upon him, not severe, not indulgent, but exact. When Harding finished, she nodded once and dismissed him with a brief word. Alistair waited until they were alone. "You rise early," he said. She inclined her head. "It is habit, so I am learning," he replied. The exchange was simple, but he did not move on at once, and neither did she. "I thought we might walk the lower fields," he said after a moment. "If you have no objection." "I have none." They set off together, not side by side at first, but within easy distance of one another. The path was familiar to him, and yet altered, better drained, more evenly cut, the hedges trimmed with care rather than severity. "You made improvements," he observed. "Yes." There was no flourish in the answer. He gestured toward a stand of young trees set back from the path. "Those were not here before." "No," she said. "The old growth had begun to fail. These will serve better in time." In time. The phrase stayed with him as they walked. She spoke of the estate without apology or defensiveness, and he found himself asking questions not to test her, but to understand. Why this pasture had been divided, why certain tenants were favoured with longer terms, why some repairs had been delayed while others had been advanced. Her answers were clear, practical, considered. He realised, with a faint start, that he was enjoying the conversation. They reached the far boundary and paused, the land falling away before them in orderly lines. For a moment, neither spoke. "You have carried a great deal," he said at last. The words escaped him before he had decided to say them. Eliza turned to look at him, surprise flickering briefly across her face before settling into composure. "It was necessary," she said. "Not thank you. Not you are kind to notice. necessary. The word did something to him. As they turned back toward the house, Alistair felt the quiet shift of something he had not known how to name before. He was no longer watching her as a man measures what has been lost. He was watching her as a man beginning, cautiously, to look forward. They returned to the house together, their steps falling into an easy, unremarked rhythm. The morning had warmed while they walked, the air no longer sharp, the light clearer against the stone of the house. As they entered through the side door, a footman paused in the act of crossing the hall, his glance flicking instinctively from one to the other before he recovered himself. The dining room bore the quiet order of a meal prepared to wait. A loaf of fresh bread rested on a board, its crust just broken. Butter stood in a shallow dish, pale and soft, and beside it a small bowl of preserved apricots, darkened with spice. A covered dish held eggs, the scent faint but inviting. Mrs. Allen, overseeing the final arrangements, looked up as they entered. "My lord, my lady." There was the briefest pause. "Shall I have it served?" Eliza answered at once, as she always did. "Yes, thank you." Alistair found himself adding, "I will stay." Mrs. Allen inclined her head, but her eyes moved quickly, discreetly between them before she turned away. The servants moved with practiced efficiency, uncovering the dishes and setting them within easy reach. When they withdrew, the room settled into quiet. Eliza reached for her tea. Alistair noticed she had not yet eaten. "You should eat while it is warm," she said, almost absently. He slid the bread toward her and lifted the lid of the egg dish, holding it while she served herself. She hesitated only a moment before accepting. The bread was excellent, light within its crust, the butter melting at once. The eggs were tender, flavoured with herbs from the kitchen garden. The preserves were rich without excess, clearly chosen with care rather than indulgence. "This is very good," he said. "Yes," she replied. "We built a new hen house, with more nesting boxes. They lay more steadily now." He smiled faintly, not at her, but at the sense of it. They ate in quiet, not strained, not intimate, simply shared. He glanced at her plate. "You've scarcely eaten," he said, not sharply, observationally. "You should take more." Eliza looked down at the plate, then back at him. "I will," she said after a moment, and reached for another piece of bread. "I will be in the still room later," she said when the last plate was cleared, "if you require me." It was information, not dismissal. "I may join you," he said, "if it would not be an inconvenience." She paused, then inclined her head. It would not. When they rose, there was a moment, small, uncertain, when neither moved at once. Then, she did. As she left the room, Alistair became aware that the servants had resumed their work with a new, quiet attention. Nothing remarked upon, nothing questioned, but nothing missed. The still room lay at the back of the house, cool even as the day warmed. Light filtered through the high windows, softened by shelves lined with glass bottles and stone jars, each carefully labelled in a neat feminine hand. Eliza moved through the space with practiced ease, removing her gloves and setting them aside before washing her hands. Alistair remained near the doorway at first, uncertain whether to enter fully or remain an observer. "You may come in," she said, without turning. "You are not in the way." He stepped forward. The room smelled faintly of herbs and fruit, lavender, dried peel, something sweet simmering gently over a low flame. On the central table lay folded cloths, a small scale, and a shallow bowl filled with dark berries. "You manage this yourself?" he asked. "Yes." She glanced at him briefly. "With help, when it is required." She lifted one of the jars and set it beside the bowl. "This is for winter," she continued, "for coughs, mostly, and for the older tenants. It keeps well." He watched her hands as she worked, steady, unhurried, entirely sure of what they were doing. "You learned all this while I was away," he said. She did not answer at once. When she did, her voice was even. "I learned what was necessary." The phrase had returned again. He moved closer, not crowding her, but near enough to sense the quiet concentration with which she held herself. He noticed how carefully she shifted her weight, how she arranged the tools within reach before beginning, as though nothing were left to chance. "You carried more than you should have," he said quietly. She stilled for only a moment. It was required, she replied. Not I had no choice. Not I suffered. Required. The air between them felt suddenly narrower, the awareness more acute. He became conscious of the closeness of her sleeve to his hand, the careful space she maintained without stepping away. You need not stay, she said after a moment, not unkindly. This is dull work. I do not find it so. She looked at him then, fully this time, as though reassessing something she had thought long settled. That surprises me, she said. It surprises me as well, he admitted. A faint, fleeting smile touched her mouth. Gone before it could invite response. She returned to her work. He remained where he was, watching, not with judgment now, but with a growing, disquieting awareness. This was not admiration from a distance, nor was it the comfort of habit. It was the slow recognition of a woman he had not known, standing very near him, shaped by years he had not shared, and for the first time since his return, Alistair felt something dangerously close to regret give way to something else entirely. Not hope, not yet, but the unmistakable pull of wanting, carefully, deliberately to know her. Chapter 8. The Truth. Alistair had not intended to stop at the inn. The decision was made without reflection, prompted by nothing more than the need to be elsewhere for an hour, to occupy himself beyond the walls of a place that had begun, inconveniently, to matter too much. The Crown and Thistle was much as he remembered it, low-ceilinged, warm with smoke and the smell of ale, its long room crowded with men whose lives were lived in proximity and habit. He took a place near the wall, ordered a drink, and allowed the noise to pass around him without engagement. He had been there only moments when he heard Merrick's name. A lady of spirit, someone was saying nearby. One grows fond of that sort. A laugh followed, too knowing, too pleased with itself. Alistair did not turn at once. Merrick sat at the table behind him, a tankard in hand, his posture loose with drink and confidence. He was speaking to two men Alistair did not recognise, his voice pitched for effect rather than privacy. I was welcomed often enough, Merrick went on lightly. A house can feel very empty when its master is abroad. Another laugh, a shrug. No harm meant, Merrick added, with a faint, superior smile. A man appreciates admiration when it's offered. The words settled heavily. Alistair rose. He crossed the room without haste, without announcement. When he stopped beside Merrick's chair, the conversation faltered, not at once, but as awareness spread. Merrick, Alistair said. Merrick looked up, surprise flickering briefly before smoothing into a smile that was almost smug. Whitcomb, Merrick said. I had heard you were returned. I am, Alistair replied evenly, and I find myself curious. Indeed? As to what you were saying just now. The smile thinned. I was only speaking generally, Merrick said lightly. You know how it is. Men talk. Indeed, Alistair said. Yet you were not speaking idly. Merrick shifted, then laughed again too quickly. If you are concerned for your wife's reputation, he said lightly, you may reassure yourself. Nothing untoward occurred. Alistair leaned closer. Be very certain, he said quietly, that you are not suggesting otherwise. The room had gone still enough for notice. Not silence exactly, but attention. Merrick's expression shifted, the easy levity giving way to something more measured. Appearances, he said, lifting his tankard. They are apt to be remarked upon. That is all. Alistair straightened. Then allow me to clarify, he said. You will not speak of my wife again. Not here, not elsewhere, not as implication, jest or boast. And if I do? Merrick asked, attempting bravado. Alistair held his gaze. Then you will discover, he said quietly, how little I value men who speak of my wife as though she were theirs to discuss. The pause that followed was long enough. Merrick looked away first. Alistair did not wait for acknowledgement. He turned and left the inn without finishing his drink. the sound of voices resuming behind him in a register notably lower than before. Outside, the afternoon air felt sharp against his lungs. Anger came first, sharp and immediate. Not the cold resentment he had carried for years, but something hotter and more exacting. Merrick's words had settled nothing. They had only confirmed how easily implications passed for truth, and how readily Eliza's name had been used by men who had no right to speak it. Alistair mounted his horse and turned back toward Harrodine at once. Whatever remained unclear would not be left to rumour again. He would hear it from her. The house was quiet when Alistair returned, not the deep stillness of night, but the measured calm of an evening settled into routine. Lamps had been lit, doors closed softly. Somewhere below, a clock marked the hour with deliberate patience. Eliza was in the small drawing room. She rose as he entered, instinctive courtesy guiding the motion. One look at his expression, however, arrested her before she could speak. "You have been riding," she said. Yes, the word was clipped. He removed his gloves with care he did not entirely feel. "We need to speak." She inclined her head. "Very well." There was no defensiveness in her posture, no retreat. She waited as she always did, upright, composed, prepared to hear what was required of her. That, unexpectedly, made it harder. "I stopped at the Crown and Thistle," he said. Merrick was there. Something flickered across her face. Not fear, nor surprise, but recognition. Mr. Merrick spoke plainly. Alistair continued, his voice controlled. Enough to leave no doubt what he meant. She did not interrupt him. "At first," he went on, "I thought it anger that drove me home. It was not." He met her gaze fully now. "It was the realization that I no longer trust any account of that time but yours." The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It was not defensive, it was shared. Eliza drew a slow breath. "It was a foolishness," she said quietly, "and it ended years ago." He waited. "I was very young," she continued. "You had been gone scarcely a year. I was lonely in ways I did not yet have language for." Her hands tightened briefly, then relaxed. Merrick was attentive. "I mistook attention for regard." "You did not love him," Alistair said. "No." The answer was immediate. "I did not love him, and I did not betray you." The words were not defiant. They were matter of fact, as though she had long since ceased needing to persuade herself of their truth. "It went no further than conversation," she added, "and small courtesies easily mistaken, and when I understood how easily such things are misread, I ended it." She looked at him then, her composure wavering, not breaking, but thinning. "I was ashamed," she said, "not because I had acted wrongly, but because I was not strong enough to bear my loneliness in silence." The room felt suddenly very small. Alistair exhaled, slow and unsteady. "I believed you capable of betrayal," he said, "and in that belief I withdrew what little warmth I had ever offered you." His jaw tightened. "That failure is mine." She said nothing. "I left you to manage everything alone," he continued, "and when rumour reached me, I chose certainty over inquiry, pride over honesty." He paused. "I am ashamed of that." Eliza's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "I did not expect you to return unchanged," she said, "but I feared, mightly, that you would judge me for a folly of my youth. I regret it sincerely, and I understand how it must have appeared to you." The words were simple. They did not undo the years between them, but they shifted something all the same. "I ask only for the chance to be present," Alistair said, "and to make amends for believing another's account of you without seeking your own, and for the coldness that followed." She considered him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. When he reached for her hand, it was not with urgency, but as an offering. She did not withdraw. Neither did she close her fingers around his. They stayed thus, joined but not yet reconciled. The distance between them narrowed by truth rather than erased by sentiment. For the first time since his return, what lay between them was no longer rumour, nor distance, nor endurance. It was choice. Later, when Eliza was alone, she sat for a long while without moving. The drawing room had returned to its accustomed calm. The fire burned low. Outside, the last of the light slipped away behind the trees. Nothing in the house suggested upheaval, and yet something fundamental had shifted all the same. She had spoken, not carefully, not defensively, but honestly, and as the woman she had become rather than the girl she had been. That alone left her unsettled. For years, she had carried the knowledge of that youthful foolishness, as one carries a sealed letter, kept, acknowledged, but never opened. It had not defined her life. It had not guided her conduct. Yet it had lingered, waiting for judgment she could not prevent. Now it had been named aloud, and not used against her. She pressed her hands together, steadying herself against the unfamiliar sensation of having been heard without dismissal. Alistair had not demanded repentance or claimed injury. He had simply spoken of his own failing. She rose at last, and moved to the window, looking out over the darkened grounds. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows lay years she could not reclaim, loneliness born quietly, decisions made without counsel, strength forged in necessity rather than choice. She did not regret the woman she had become, but she did mourn the cost. Behind her, the house continued in its ordered way. Doors closed, footsteps passed. Life, managed and contained, went on. For the first time in many years, Eliza allowed herself to imagine a different future, not one shaped entirely by endurance or by the careful independence she had cultivated, but by something less certain, not promises, not passion, but the possibility of standing beside someone, rather than always alone. She did not yet know whether she trusted that possibility, but she knew this. She would no longer accept judgment in place of understanding, nor reserve where honesty was due. If this marriage were to become more than a settled arrangement, it would be by mutual choosing, or not at all. That night, she extinguished the lamp and went to bed with a quiet resolve. Whatever came next, she would meet it with honesty. Chapter 9. Choosing Each Other. Alistair altered his course the very next day. He did not say so aloud, but Eliza perceived the change. He did not send for her. He sought her out. She was in the North Passage when he found her, speaking with Mrs. Allen about the week's accounts. At his approach, the housekeeper paused instinctively, then looked to Eliza. "That will be all," Eliza said. Mrs. Allen withdrew at once. Alistair waited until they were alone. "I wondered," he said, "whether you might walk with me this morning, if your duties allow it." The phrasing was careful, an invitation, not a summons. "They will allow it," she replied, after a brief consideration. They set out toward the gardens, the air mild, the gravel firm beneath their steps. This time, he matched her pace deliberately, neither overtaking nor lagging behind. "I should like to understand your plans for the West Field," he said. "Harding mentioned drainage. You spoke before of rotation." She did not answer at once, as though weighing whether the interest would endure. Then she began to explain, plainly, practically, without embellishment. She spoke of soil and yield, of patience rather than haste, of decisions made with years in mind. He listened, fully. When they reached the far end of the walk, he slowed. "There is a meeting with the miller this afternoon," he said. "Harding mentioned it. You usually attend." "Yes." "May I take it instead?" She stopped. "I do not mean to overrule you," he added at once, "only to spare you the time. I will report back, and you may correct me where I err." A faint, unwilling smile touched her mouth. "You will be corrected," she said. "I should expect nothing less." She considered him a moment longer, then inclined her head. "Very well. He will attempt to raise his price. Do not let him." "I will endeavour to disappoint him," Alistair replied. They resumed their walk. Eliza became aware of something unfamiliar settling within her. Not relief, exactly, but the cautious sense of a burden being shared rather than assumed. For the first time, his presence did not feel like supervision. It felt like partnership. Alistair did not return from the meeting with the miller until late afternoon. Eliza had told herself she would not watch for him. She had duties enough to occupy her attention, and she attended to them with her usual care, reviewing the still room stores, speaking briefly with Harding, and signing 2 letters that required her seal. And yet, when she heard the sound of hooves in the courtyard, she looked up. She was in the small back parlour when he entered, removing his gloves with a faintly rueful expression. "You were correct," he said, without preamble. He did attempt to raise his price. "And?" she asked. And he was disappointed. She smiled. "You agreed to the same terms as before?" "With a clause regarding transport," he replied. "He will deliver directly to the West stores." Harding confirmed it will save time. She studied him for a moment. "You remembered," she said. "I did." She smiled. "I'm glad." He hesitated, then said, "I should like your opinion on the clause." "I brought the draft." He extended the paper, waiting. She took it, reading carefully. He did not hover. He did not explain. He stood beside the window, allowing her the space to consider it on her own terms. "It is sound," she said at last. "You anticipated his objections." "I remembered what you said," he replied. They stood there a moment longer, the business concluded, the air between them unaccountably changed by the absence of tension. "Will you dine with me this evening?" he asked. She looked up, faintly surprised by the question. "I should like that," she said. They ate together with an ease that had long been absent. The table was laid with the bounty of the estate. Roast chicken seasoned with herbs from the garden, beetroots and carrots cooked until tender and sweet, and roast potatoes. Fresh, dark-crusted bread was set alongside a small plate of cheese made on the estate. It was good food, honest food. The sort Eliza always ensured was served whether she took her place at the table or not. Tonight, she did. Conversation moved easily between them, touching first on neutral matters, the miller's temper, the weather turning cooler, a hedge that would need laying before winter. There was no strain in it, no careful circling. They ate together with an ease that had long been absent. Eliza ate little herself, but she paid close attention to him. What he favoured, what he set aside. He helped himself again to the carrots, but left the beetroots largely untouched. She noted it quietly, resolving to speak to the cook before the next meal. When the dishes were cleared, a small dish was set between them. Baked apples, softened and split, filled with nuts and honey, their edges darkened just enough to release their scent. He paused. "I had forgotten this," he said quietly. Eliza poured the cream and allowed herself the smallest smile. "You were exacting about it," she said. He tasted it, then looked at her. "It is perfect," he said. She acknowledged the compliment with a small smile. He set his spoon down more slowly than before. "You have kept the house well," he said. She met his gaze. "It is ours." As the meal wore on, the conversation between them grew less cautious. Not intimate, precisely, but settled. After dinner, they did not rise at once. The servants moved quietly about the room, clearing the table with practiced discretion. When the last dish was removed, Alistair stood and offered his arm, not with ceremony, but as though the next step required no discussion. "The small drawing room," he suggested. Eliza hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes." The room was already lit, the fire laid low but steady, lending warmth without heat. It was a familiar space, arranged for comfort rather than display. Eliza took her usual chair by the window and reached for the work basket beside it, drawing out a small child's shift she had been embroidering for the parish. Fine linen, softened by handling, the stitches nearly invisible unless one looked closely. Alistair poured himself a measure of port and settled opposite her, the glass cradled loosely in his hand. For a time neither spoke. The quiet was not strained. It held. Eliza worked with practiced ease, her movements steady and unhurried. Alistair watched the fire, then the slow, careful progress of the needle through cloth. "That is very neat work," he said at last. She glanced down at it. It must be. Mrs. Allen checks everything before it goes out to the parish. A corner of his mouth lifted. I had not realized she inspired such diligence. She inspires order, Eliza replied, and occasionally, terror. He gave a soft huff of amusement. I will endeavour to remain in her good graces then. Wise, Eliza replied, returning to her stitching. She has survived 3 masters of the house. Then I am already at a disadvantage, he said. She glanced up at that. Consider it character building. Alistair took a sip of his port. You do this often, he asked, nodding toward the garment in her hands. In the evenings, she said. It occupies the hands, after the day has already occupied the mind. He considered that. I had assumed it was merely habit. It is, she said lightly, a useful one. He smiled then, not broadly, but without restraint. The ease of it surprised them both. They remained there, conversation ebbing and returning in small, unforced currents. He spoke of the port, better than he remembered. It improves when it is allowed to rest properly, she said. Neither reached for the other, neither withdrew. They shared the room and the fire in easy silence, and for the first time, the quiet between them did not feel like distance. It felt like the way a home should be. Time passed without either remarking it. Eliza worked steadily, the pattern beneath her fingers growing almost without her awareness. Alistair finished his port and set the glass aside, though he did not rise. The fire burned low, casting a steady, familiar warmth. At one point, Eliza realized she had reached the end of her thread. She paused, examined the final stitch, then set the work carefully back into the basket. I should stop for the night, she said. If I go on, I will grow careless. A dangerous habit, he replied mildly. One I have learned to avoid, Eliza said. He smiled at that, slightly, and without thinking. The smile lingered longer than he intended. Eliza noticed. The awareness between them sharpened, subtle, unmistakable, not urgency, only a shared attentiveness, newly present. He rose then, slowly, as though mindful of the change. I will not keep you, he said. She stood as well, smoothing her hands over the front of her gown, out of habit rather than necessity. Good night, she said. Good night, Eliza, he said softly. He had spoken her name before, but not like that. She met his gaze, something unguarded flickering there before she gathered herself again. Good night, she repeated, and moved toward the door. He did not follow her. He did not call her back. But as she reached the threshold, she paused. Tomorrow, she said without turning. There is a matter with the accounts I would value your opinion on. His answer came at once. I would like that. She nodded, once, and left the room. Alistair remained where he was for a moment longer, listening to the quiet of the house. The familiar sounds threaded now with something new, not triumph, not certainty, but intention. Upstairs, Eliza closed her door and leaned briefly against it, her breath unsteady in a way she did not entirely understand. Nothing extraordinary had happened, and yet, for the first time in a very long while, she did not feel alone. That night, sleep was slow in coming for both of them, and neither regretted the evening. Chapter 10. A Public Union. They were expected that evening at Ashcombe Hall, where a formal dinner had drawn much of the neighbouring gentry. Eliza came to the foot of the stairs with unhurried composure, her steps measured, her gaze steady. The gown she wore had been chosen with care, elegant without excess, its colour deepened by the evening light, its lines simple and assured. Alistair stood below as she descended. He had seen her dressed for dinner before. That did nothing to prepare him for the way she looked now. The gown followed the line of her body with quiet precision, close at the waist, flaring gently at her hips as she moved. His attention was caught and held. The effect was immediate. Eliza felt the pause before she reached the last step. She sensed his stillness, the weight of his gaze, and did not hurry herself to ease it. He saw her then, not as mistress of the house, nor as a presence long taken for granted, but as a woman of uncommon beauty, composed and assured, approaching him. For a brief moment, he did not move. He simply watched, conscious of the stillness his silence imposed. When she reached the last step, he turned fully toward her. His gaze held hers, and did not immediately release it. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice lower than before. "Yes," she said, and found that the word came easily. He offered his arm. When she took it, her hand resting lightly at his sleeve, the contact settled something in him that had been unsettled for years. For Eliza, it felt like recognition, long delayed and finally complete. As they were announced at Ashcombe Hall, Alistair felt the shift at once. He had not anticipated the effect of her presence upon the room. Conversation softened as she entered beside him. Heads turned, not abruptly, not rudely, but with a collective, unspoken attention that followed her progress. She did not alter her pace or her expression. She crossed the room as though it belonged to her. And for the first time, he saw her not only as he saw her, but as others did. Her hair had been dressed for the evening with deliberate restraint, pinned smooth at the crown and allowed to fall into softer curls at her temples. It suited her. Everything about her did. There was nothing studied in her appearance, nothing arranged for admiration, only care, confidence, and a quiet certainty of place. He realized with a faint jolt of surprise that others were watching her as well, not with curiosity, but with attention. She met greetings calmly, returning courtesies with effortless grace, her expression open yet composed. When she smiled, it was measured and genuine, transforming her features in a way that lingered long after the smile itself had faded. She did not fidget. She did not glance about for approval. She stood as though she belonged exactly where she was, and always had. It struck him then that he had never truly seen her in company before, not like this. This was not the girl he had married, eager and uncertain, nor the distant figure he had imagined during his years away. This was a woman entirely at ease with herself, her rank, and the regard of others. Her beauty was not dazzling. It held the eye instead, and once it did, he found it difficult to look away. He became aware of the quiet attention that followed her through the room, and a tightening settled in his chest. Pride, simple and sure, at having her beside him as his wife. And as they moved forward together, he was aware only of how naturally they did so. The dinner at Ashcombe Hall was a large one, though not ostentatious. Neighbours, landholders, and a few distant relations gathered more for familiarity than for display. The table was long, the candles numerous, and the air warm with conversation and the scent of roasted meats and late-season vegetables. Eliza was accustomed to such evenings. She knew their rhythm and their quiet calculations. Who must be seated where? Which topics eased conversation? Which invited unease? What was new was that Alistair moved beside her, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He inclined his head to their hostess and spoke briefly, then turned, not to survey the room but to Eliza. "I am out of practice," he said quietly. "You'll tell me if I err." "You are doing very well," she replied. Throughout the first course, conversation flowed easily. Questions were put to Alistair about his travels, about his return. He answered them politely and briefly, redirecting attention away from himself whenever he could. "The credit is not mine," he said, when someone remarked upon the evident prosperity of Harrowdean. "The estate has been in capable hands throughout my absence." He did not elaborate. The pause that followed was brief, but unmistakable. Several eyes turned toward Eliza with renewed interest, different now, assessing rather than merely curious. She met them calmly, answering when addressed and deflecting praise without false modesty. As the evening wore on, the room seemed to adjust around them. Chairs angled closer, conversation softened. What had begun as watchfulness settled into acceptance. At one point, as the servants cleared the second course, Alistair leaned closer, not touching, but near enough that Eliza felt his warmth. "You are doing very well," he murmured, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. She glanced at him, surprised to find no self-consciousness in herself at all. "So are you," she replied. Later, When the ladies withdrew, Eliza rose with the others, understanding, out of long habit, that this was the moment of separation. As she passed, his hand touched her back, brief and deliberate, a gesture so unlike him that it stilled her for half a step. She felt the faint pressure of his fingers and knew, without looking, that he was watching her go. When the ladies returned, the room settled into a looser arrangement, chairs drawn closer, voices lowered. Eliza had only just rejoined Alistair when a gentleman approached, one who had arrived after dinner, his presence still new to the room. "Viscountess Harrowdean," Mr. Merrick said, bowing. "It has been some time." "It has," she replied, her manner polite and unguarded. Alistair stepped naturally into place at her side. "Merrick," he said, inclining his head. Mr. Merrick's gaze moved between them, registering the ease with which they stood together. "I am glad to hear Harrowdean is flourishing," he said after a moment. "It is much spoken of." "I am pleased to hear it," Eliza said. Alistair inclined his head. "Indeed." Mr. Merrick bowed once more. "You will excuse me." When he had gone, Alistair turned slightly toward her. "Shall we?" he said. She took his arm. When the evening finally drew to a close and they took their leave, the farewells were warm, unremarkable, and unencumbered by speculation. In the carriage home, the quiet between them was companionable rather than careful. Eliza watched the familiar road pass beyond the window. Alistair sat opposite her, relaxed in a way she had never seen him before. "We make a tolerable pair," he said at last. She considered that. "I think we do." He nodded once, as though that settled something. And for the first time, Eliza felt certain that it had. Harrowdean rose ahead of them, lamps lit, the house waiting. Not as a burden, not as a proving ground, but as a place already known. When they entered, they did so together. The household no longer seemed to belong to one of them, more than the other. Eliza handed her gloves to a waiting servant and turned, expecting out of habit to retire alone. Alistair did not release her arm. "Will you come with me?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze, saw no uncertainty there, and felt none herself. "Yes." They went upstairs together, unhurried, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. When the door closed behind them, the rest of the house seemed to fall away. What lay between them no longer required distance, only trust. That night, they did not part. Later, as Eliza lay in Alistair's arms, she reflected on the long path that had led them here and smiled, the expression unseen and wholly her own. The uncertainties that had once divided them had been answered, not with words but with presence. Whatever distance had once existed between them had at last been laid to rest. And in its place remained something steady, chosen, and enduring. Epilogue. 2 years later. The pains had been coming steadily for hours when the midwife finally turned from the bed. "It is time, sir." Alistair did not argue. He rose at once, though his hand lingered in Eliza's a moment longer than necessary. "I will be just beyond the door," he said quietly. "You are not alone." She nodded, tightening her fingers once around his before releasing him. The door closed behind him, and the room filled with women's voices, measured instructions, and the rhythm of Eliza's own breath. Time lost its meaning after that. There was only effort and pain born through resolve, and the knowledge that this too would pass. When the cry came at last, sharp, indignant, unmistakably alive, Eliza felt the world steady beneath her. "It is a boy," the midwife said, satisfaction warming her voice. Later, when the room had been put to rights and the child lay wrapped and sleeping against Eliza's breast, the door opened once more. Alistair stepped inside. He took in the scene in a single glance. Eliza pale but upright against the pillows. The small bundle nestled securely against her, and then he stopped. For a moment, he seemed unable to move at all. Then he crossed the room and sank to his knees beside the bed. One hand braced against the coverlet, the other lifted, as though he did not quite trust himself to touch. "My God," he said softly. Eliza reached for him. Her fingers found his sleeve, then his hand. "We are well," she said. "Both of us." He bowed his head, his breath unsteady, and pressed his forehead briefly to her hand, as though in gratitude rather than despair. "A son," he said again, wonder roughening the word. She shifted the child slightly. "Come closer." Only then did he rest his hand gently against the baby's back, his touch reverent and unsure. The child stirred, then settled again. Alistair laughed once under his breath, a sound broken and wholly unguarded, and wiped at his eyes with the heel of his hand, making no attempt to hide it. Outside, the house moved quietly into morning. Inside the chamber, everything felt stilled and complete. Later, when the midwife had withdrawn and the room had grown quiet, Alistair rose and sat beside Eliza, drawing her carefully against him. His arm curved around her, and the child with instinctive certainty. She rested her head against his shoulder, exhaustion and contentment mingling into something almost weightless. She closed her eyes, listening to their breathing, and let the moment hold. Together, they had made something that would last. The end. Thank you, dear listener, for sharing a portion of your day with this story. Fresh tales arrive each Tuesday, and on Sundays as well, for those clever souls who have joined the channel. Should you wish to buy me a cup of tea, you'll find a discreet little button just below, perfectly respectable, I assure you. I shall return soon with another romance, provided I am not carried off by moonlight and mischief.